Uh, Hello and welcome to the second program in the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Yiddish Culture Series. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Program Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Our Yiddish Culture Series explores the culture of the Yiddish-speaking world of the 18th and 19th centuries that flourished in Central and Eastern Europe, really up until the early part of the 20th century. While the Holocaust destroyed much of that world, the culture lived on through survivors and through immigrants who managed to escape Nazi-controlled Europe or who came to America in the years or decades before the Nazis rose to power. Our programs seek to draw attention to that Yiddish culture and to the ways it was sustained in America. And here, let me also add an advertisement or two for some other upcoming programs. I hope you'll join me tomorrow at 11 a.m. for the next edition of my weekly Curator's Corner program. This week, in honor of the D-Day anniversary that just passed, I'm going to be talking about a Nazi flag that was pulled down by American troops in a secret unit and then decorated to memorialize their work to liberate Europe. On Thursday at 1 o'clock, we're offering a virtual guided tour of our museum. And next Tuesday, on June 16th at 1 p.m., we will hold a program entitled China's Crimes Against Humanity and the Enslavement of the Uyghur People, which will explore the ethnic cleansing of the Uyghur Muslim minority population that's currently taking place in Western China. As always, you can find a full list of our programs under the Events tab of our website at www.hmtcli.org. Okay, let's talk about today's program. Today, we're honored to have Linda Burghardt speaking about the art of Marc Chagall, perhaps the most famous artist to emerge from the Yiddish-speaking world of the early 20th century, and one whose work remains iconic today. I should add here that our program with Linda Burghardt is funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are very grateful for their help in making this program possible. Let me just take care of some logistical issues. Okay. I want to invite you to pose any questions you have for Dr. Burghardt through the Q&A tab on the bottom or in the top of your screen. We'll make sure to set aside time at the end of our program to allow Dr. Burghardt time to respond. With those logistical issues out of the way, let me introduce Dr. Linda Burghardt, who is a journalist, an author, and I'm pleased to say the scholar in residence at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. Oops, I'm just having some technical issues here. Dr. Burghardt holds a PhD from LIU Post and is the daughter of Holocaust survivors from Vienna, making her connection to the Holocaust Memorial a personal one. Her career has included working as a freelance reporter for the New York Times for 20 years, and she's also the author of 3 nonfiction books and numerous articles and essays that have been published in newspapers across the US and overseas. She has lectured widely to both national and international audiences, and we're honored to hear her speak today about the art of Marc Chagall. So with that, I hope that I can introduce Linda Burghardt.
Hi, Thorin. Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk about Marc Chagall and his place in the world of art and in Jewish history. And now I will share my screen so I can do my PowerPoint and show you a whole bunch of pictures of his. Okay, so can everybody see the screen? Are we okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, good. So I thought I'd start right away with a photo of Marc Chagall. So here he is. Whoops, this is not advancing. All right, let me go back and go out of this and see if this is going to work a different way. All right, let me stop sharing and go back to here. Sorry about all of this. Let me see whether it works now. Okay, great. Here we are. So here is the artist in his studio, and that's coming through clearly, Thorin?
I think you need to share your screen again.
Oops, okay. All righty. Let me go back here. Oh, so many technical difficulties. Okay, let me get one here. I think this should work. Right, let's see, full screen. Are we okay now?
Yes, thank you.
Yay, okay, good. Okay, so here's Marc Chagall in his studio, and I thought I would start by telling you a quote about him. He's been called the greatest Jewish painter of all time. So, yet the truth is, his work defied categorization. He always objected to people trying to put him in a box and say he was this, that, or the other thing. And the reason, in part, is that he had many sources of inspiration. So one of them was his Jewish roots, which we see here in the Rabbi and the Torah. And another was his deep love for Russian village life, as portrayed here in Rain on the Town. And three, his unique style of French modernist art, which we see here in Married Lovers in a Blue World. So Chagall strongly objected to define his works as quintessentially Jewish. And yet sometimes pictures can speak louder than words. We want to try to find out what matters to a person. For example, if we want to know what matters to us, take a look in your checkbook and see what you're spending money on. Well, with Chagall, we could just look at what he painted and determine from there what really mattered to him. So we see in many of his paintings that he painted the alleyways of his shtetl in Russia with their hunchback villagers, and he painted many wedding couples floating through the air, as expressed so tenderly here in the promenade. This is actually a picture of himself and his wife Bella, and they're so happy being together that Bella seems to be able to float. So sometimes the pictures that Chagall painted sometimes they were herrings, sometimes they were green Jews, sometimes they were uncles with fiddles, sometimes aunts with uncles, cows and goats upside down. So he said in an interview once that he had magical, mysterious memories from childhood, and he painted what he saw in front of his eyes and in his dreams. So art scholars who have studied him quite a bit, broadly and deeply, they say that his style was a unique fusion of several techniques: Cubism, folk art, surrealism, and expressionism. And we see this here in his painting, The Dream. So his work shifted constantly from reality to fantasy and back again from the physical to the spiritual. And he was steered by his conflicting and sometimes coordinating sources of inspiration. But his Judaism underlay everything he did. So Chagall influenced untold numbers of artists in his time, and he continues to do so today. He's made invaluable contributions to the understanding of Jewish culture, as we can see here in one of his earliest paintings, A Spoonful of Milk. This is a tender portrait of his mother and father. So his parents were very devout Jews, and I'll talk a little more about his early life. And his father here is studying, and his mother is making sure that he's fed and well and able to continue his life as he wants to live it. So in all of his complexity, was Marc Chagall a painter first or a Jew first? So let's start with his early life and see what we can find out. So Marc Chagall was born in a small town called Vitebsk. Here it is. It's a very mixed town. As you can see, there are low houses in the front. That's the shtetl part. And then there are the churches and monasteries in the background that show that his town had many people and many different views, and people seemed to get along. So at the time when he was born, Vitebsk was in White Russia. It is now today Belarus. So he was born on July 7th, 1887, but he wasn't always called Marc Chagall. Interestingly, he started life with a different name that's a little more familiar to Ashkenazi Jews. He was Moshe Siegel. So the family he was born into was Hasidic, and he was the oldest of 9 children. He had 7 sisters and 1 brother. And the part of the town where he lived was characterized, sadly, by poverty and a lack of art and education. He painted many, many pictures of his hometown. We'll see them throughout the program today. So where he lived was a small country village within the town of Vitebsk with narrow streets and low houses and courtyards and gardens. He painted many pictures and of his hometown, and here is the marketplace in Vitebsk, another view. His father worked as a clerk in a herring factory, and Chagall said he often had herring for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And he painted, later on, he painted many fish motifs, such as this one here in Flying Fish. So out of respect for his father, he said he was interested in fish and tried to paint them as often as he could. So his mother ran a small grocery store from her home, and his parents were avid Zionists. And this would have a deep effect on him later on in his life, in his relationship to Israel. He felt an instantaneous sense of belonging when he went to Israel for the first time. So his mother, he said in his autobiography, was full of energy. I owe her everything, he said. I owe everything to her. She would correct my work, and her opinion had a decisive importance. The treasure of her talent is alive in me. He said, my father was timid by nature, gentle and peace-loving, religious, but had little in common with typical Jews. He was more like a peasant. So here is a painting of both of them, portrait of my parents, which is interesting to see. The colors are similar except for the father's beard, very important part of himself as a Zionist and a Hasidic Jew. His mother and father seem to be looking in different directions, which may be a comment on the marriage or maybe a comment on their unity in that they could work together with different strengths. So in his early education, Chagall studied Hebrew and the Bible at the local cheder, the school for Jewish children. So all of his lessons were in Yiddish, and he mastered the rudiments of a Jewish education, and he took singing and violin lessons, and he helped the cantor at the synagogue. So he juxtaposes several of these images in his painting, Solitude. You see a violin, violins will show up very frequently. There are always animals, there are often rabbis, and the town in the background, that's a theme and a technique of Chagall. When he was 13, his education at cheder was done, but his mother wanted him to go on further. She wanted him to have an education and have a more worldly view of life. So she successfully bribed officials at the local Russian school where Jews were not allowed, but she was able to get him admitted despite his Jewishness. So Chagall was always a daydreamer, and he would see hazy visions out of every window, and visions often that only he could see, such as a cow flying over a city, as we see here in Cow over Vitebsk. And Vitebsk is down in the background. Again, we will see that in many pictures. We've got a violin, we've got a cow, we've got an animal playing the violin. This comes up very frequently. And the sun, if you notice, is low. So why is that? Are all these characters floating so high that they're above the sun? So he stuttered when he spoke when he was young, but he did overcome that. He was very verbal. He wrote beautifully. He learned to speak very well, but he always had that little bit of a stutter to deal with. But he excelled at geometry, kind of not surprising in a way. At the school, he learned Russian, and he came into contact with middle-class life, really for the first time. It was there in school that he saw any form of art for the first time. There was none at home or at the synagogue. And that's because in very religious households, as we know, images are unacceptable. They're considered ungodly. But in the Russian school, he saw a classmate drawing a picture. He was entranced. So he asked the boy, how do you do that? And the boy just said to him, you just find a book and you copy the picture. Well, this had never occurred to Chagall. This was a new thought. So he did that, and he loved it immediately. And he declared to his mother that he would become a painter. And this is how he imagined himself at the time. And though his parents fiercely objected to his goals, to this new idea, totally new idea, he was enchanted, and he began sketching on his own. And as we know, he never stopped. So he would stand on the rooftop of his house, and as he put it, he was suspended between heaven and earth. It's a lovely thought, and you could just imagine being there. And he looked down on the vibrant sights and sounds of his town, and he absorbed everything. He painted merchants, he painted cantors, everything he saw ultimately made it into his pictures. Cows, goats, neighbors, relatives. Here we have an example in I and the Village. In this painting, various memories of the city appear together, like pieces of a kaleidoscope. And we can see how his ability at geometry came to play in putting this cubist type of picture together. So a particularly influential person on his life was his uncle Noah, who played klezmer music on the violin to Chagall's great delight. So Chagall's paintings of him as the Fiddler on the Roof inspired the title of the well-known musical. Now, there are many Fiddler on the Roof pictures, and as we know, many fiddler pictures in Chagall's work. This is one of his earliest. He said that when his uncle danced around the room playing, he himself became so happy that his own head would gently float off his body and follow his uncle around. So Chagall was very strongly drawn to folk culture, and he later claimed that he had never shaken the Russian soil of his childhood from his boots, that it clung to him all his life. And we see that in his pictures. His Hasidic roots are clearly visible in many of his paintings. And his airborne subjects, as we see here in The Flying Lovers, speak of his upbringing and represent their wishes for freedom. He absorbed the flavors of the Jewish shtetls and more. Everything around him seemed to go into his very visual brain. Also churches and monasteries, which existed in Vitebsk, that's so hard to say, besides the synagogues. And he saw pigs wandering the streets. He saw dark-robed priests crossing themselves. And his storehouse of visual images would forever be enhanced by the rich and charming and very emotional landscapes of his childhood. So at the age of 19, in 1906, we think back to all those years, he began his formal art education at a private drawing school in Vitebsk. He didn't like the realistic documentation of shtetl life, though, that he was taught to draw there. And he wanted to set out on his own with his own ideas. And the art school wouldn't accept his ideas. They were radical, and the school was very tied to realistic interpretations. So he decided that what he had to do was leave town, and the place to go was St. Petersburg. So he was able to save money and get to the railway station and hop on the train to St. Petersburg after months of planning. So St. Petersburg at the time was Russia's capital, and it was the cultural center at the time, the capital of the empire, and this is why it was so exciting to him. And it was the center of the country's artistic life. He knew this, he learned that from the art school that he attended. And it was full of famous art schools, inspiration, famous artists, and central squares, very much like this one. So Jews, however, were banned from the capital city by Russian law. So he had to live a clandestine life. And for the next 3 years, he absorbed everything that he could see. But his art was made, sadly, in poverty and despair. He had no permit to live in St. Petersburg, and he was in constant danger of arrest. And he made his living painting shop signs. So Nicholas II was the Tsar of Russia at the time. And the atmosphere in St. Petersburg was actually perfect for a budding, aspiring artist because it was full of cultural upheaval and social tension, just the right kind of emotional and cultural and political atmosphere that an artist would love. And this was a result of the city's contact with the intellectual movements of the more advanced countries in Europe. So he went home to visit Vitebsk in 1909 when he was just 21 and met a young woman named Bella Rosenfeld. Here she is. She became very important in his life. They were at a gathering at a friend's home, and Bella was 17 years old. She was the youngest daughter of a rich local merchant. The family owned several jewelry stores. And she was studying history and philosophy and literature in Moscow, but was home on vacation. She was to become a Yiddish author and would inspire many of Chagall's creations. Quickly, they fell in love, and they agreed in secret that they would find a way to marry. But the following year, to push his work forward, Chagall left Russia for Paris. It was here that he changed his name from Moshe Siegel to Marc Chagall in order to fit in better with the artistic society that he was striving to join. He went back to Vitebsk on his birthday to bid goodbye to Bella, who had become his fiancée. And he was so happy to be with her that he felt sure that he was flying. Still, her parents did not approve of their union. When he went back to Paris after the short visit, he loved it. He loved it right away, and he continued to love it, even though he didn't speak any French for the longest amount of time. But the city was filled with Russian emigres, and here's how he looked as a young man. At this time, he was intense, excitable, and deeply introspective. He called Paris my second Vitebsk, just about the biggest compliment that he could give any city at all. And he made friends with the painters that he met. Amazing people, Modigliani, Matisse, Braque, and Picasso. Very exalted society that he was able to find his way into. So Chagall noted something then. He said, I noticed early on the Jews have two basic alternatives for joining the art world: hide or deny their Jewish roots, or cherish and publicly express them. At this time in my life, I have yet to decide which to choose. So he longed to develop his own personal artistic style. Cubism was the dominant art form, a style that consisted basically of, this is simplistic, but interlocking shapes and geometric planes. But Chagall saw the world differently. He was driven by a very strong sense of color and a deeply playful sense of humor. So he thought of art as he put it once in his autobiography, emerging from the internal outward, from the seen object to the psychic outpouring. Very, very deep words that tell quite a story about his art and his language ability and his view of the world. So here we see Bride and Groom at the Eiffel Tower, which is an expression of this psychic outpouring that he's discussing. So he produced his most important early paintings in these years. And he did this by developing his unique combination of Jewish and Russian folk art, modernistic techniques, and sometimes Cubism. So he created a style of painting whose works emphasize strong color and imagination over realism, as we see here in his Romeo and Juliet. So Chagall painted Jewish motifs and subjects from his memories, his rich, thick, dark memories. And he said, my homeland exists deep in my soul. And he developed a repertoire of creative, unique images. And his work often also displayed unique proportions, floating figures, illogical juxtapositions that said a great deal about what he was thinking. And we see this here in The Cattle Dealer with its flat, strange perspective. So at this time, Chagall was developing into an art form called Expressionism. And this was a modernist movement that sought to express the meaning of emotional experience rather than physical reality. And if we remember, Chagall was born at the beginning of July, so he's a Cancer, and Cancers are known as very emotional people who honor their emotional reality. And so, whereas in Russia, he had felt hemmed in by his Jewish identity, here in Paris, he felt a lot of freedom and he saw light everywhere. He painted feverishly. He barely ate, he barely slept, he was on fire. When he couldn't afford canvas or couldn't find any left over in his little apartment, he ripped off his own shirt and he used it instead. He is also was known as using tablecloths and even sometimes curtains, so his landlady was not thrilled with him. But like many artists, he painted a number of self-portraits, such as this one shown here with a photo of how he looked at the time. So a big change came to his life when he went back to Vitebsk for his sister's wedding in 1914. 1914, of course, should give us a hint that things were changing, things were becoming difficult. He had planned to stay for 3 months, but World War I broke out, and then the Communist Revolution came. And what was supposed to be a brief visit, a 3-month visit, turned into an 8-year stay. The borders of Russia were closed, and he couldn't leave. Nevertheless, these turned out to be some of the happiest years in his life. He was very happily engaged to Bella, and he painted her whenever he could, often with himself in the picture, as we see here in Together with My Love. She is the focal point. He is just a small piece with his beautiful blue eye, but you can see the love that they have for each other. Her parents still didn't think he could support her. They were still really not in favor of the union. So what did he do? He started painting lovely, airy, beautiful pictures, happy pictures of the town and the countryside and Bella to make money. It's a good plan. They not only made him money, they made him famous. He painted what he saw around him in an appealing style, as here, as we see in the three candles, and slowly but surely, he gained the recognition that he sought. Finally, he married Bella in 1915 when he was 28. A year later, their daughter Ida, their only child, was born. And he and Bella were very happy together. And he painted portraits and pictures of Jewish life, and his work, with its strong vein of fantasy, was received with great interest. Here we see him at his easel, and he displays his happiness to be at work and his matrimonial bliss. Now, we see Bella floating above him with a green face. Somehow in Chagall, when he puts in green, it's usually a sign of happiness and unity. And we see Bella, she's floating above him, she's inspiring him, she's sharing his joy, and she seems weightless, she seems floating. That's always a sign with Chagall that there's happiness present. And yet together, even though she's floating and there's only part of her there, they provide a sense of solidity. So, but the more he observed, he said, the more he felt intuitively that the world that he loved so much was somehow teetering on the verge of distinction. So at this time, his works were exhibited across Russia, and some wealthy collectors began to bid with each other to purchase his paintings, such as this one, double portrait with wine glass, which was very popular. And it has a view of his beloved Vitebsk down at the bottom in the background. And he had successful showings in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, but the communists didn't understand his art. Why is the man sitting on the woman's shoulder? Why is there another man on his head? In his other paintings, why is the cow green? Why is the horse flying through the sky? And how is this connected with Marx and Lenin? Nevertheless, he viewed his future in Vitebsk with optimism. The revolutionary government had given Jews equal rights with other citizens for the first time. Jews were actually allowed to become citizens in Russia at this time. Totally revolutionary, radical idea. Here we see in view over Vitebsk the figure of an elderly Jewish man. This is a frequent subject of his paintings. A man with a walking stick and a bag slung over his shoulder. So why is that? Is this a familiar image? And it is in many ways. This is the wandering Jew. This is the man in flight, a symbol of the diaspora. A flying man, though, gives the sense of an everyday miracle, as if flying were a normal everyday activity, a normal human activity. And to Chagall, it was. And the juxtaposition of the flying man and the realistic scenes of the village give a very unusual sense to this picture. So now at this time, with all of his success, he turned to theater and began designing murals and sets and costumes for Moscow's Jewish Chamber Theater for their first Sholem Aleichem set of plays. So his murals were called Hebrew Jazz in Paint. Again, very different set of techniques and different range of colors, and the sharpness contrasts so much with the previous picture, which is hazy and soft. And these murals were forerunners of his later large-scale works, including murals at the New York Metropolitan Opera and Lincoln Center, such as the spectacular Triumph of Music, a painting that has pleased thousands, if not millions, of people who have gone to the Met. So Moscow was now the capital of the USSR, the new USSR. But Chagall found that his free spirit just somehow didn't fit in. There was a pragmatic ethos from the revolution that just didn't quite work with him, and he suffered frequent clashes with his colleagues. Finally, like other Jewish artists of his time, he decided that what he should do with his efforts is turn to preserving what he saw as his threatened Jewish heritage. We see this here in Wedding in a Jewish Village. The Jewish village, of course, is Vitebsk, down at the bottom in the background, and it's a love scene which he portrayed so many times, and also here in The Sweetest Song. So Chagall decided that it was imperative for the development of his art that he go back to France. So it was 1923, he was 36 years old, he was married to Bella, and with their 7-year-old daughter, Ida, they were a strong, happy family union. Here they are in one of their rare family portraits. There are very few pictures, surprisingly. So his paintings now portrayed love, family, and nature in vivid colors and with flowing lines, very pleasing. He painted landscapes, somewhat similar to the Impressionist painters of the time, with colors blended that were put together to convey a feeling of light falling onto the scene. He was told that he had turned French. He loved this. He thought this was just wonderful. And here we see in As Love Blossoms, a very French, I think, sense of color and line. So in many of his works, landscapes and portraits merge together in somewhat astonishing inventions. So here, in a giant bouquet of flowers high above a river, are two secret lovers, and it's almost as if they are in a Garden of Eden. So it was in these years in Paris that he devoted himself to reconstructing his memories of his Russian homeland. And he revised an old beloved painting that we all know, The Violinist on the left. Again, the green face, meaning to Chagall, it seems, that this is important and this person is important. And so he did this first violinist on the left in 1911, early years for him. And he produced the green violinist during this time period in Paris when he was reconstructing. In the green violinist, you'll see many differences. The violinist is now standing on two roofs, which is kind of a bigger universal feeling. In addition to a green face, his right hand is green. And there's kind of a different sense of joy, and there's a little floating figure in the back that has changed between the two paintings. So these are two of his most famous paintings, iconic works that speak eloquently of his influence on both art and also Jewish sensibility, Jewish cultural sensibility in particular. So as we've noticed, violins appear frequently in Chagall's work, and sometimes they're even flying. So why is that? Well, it was a tradition in his Hasidic community for a violinist to play at important events, births, wedding celebrations, funerals, and it still is today in many Jewish communities today. In many of Chagall's paintings, the violinist, though, becomes more than a violinist and becomes almost a mythical figure, a kind of guardian angel that is supposed to help protect the people who are going through this transition of birth or marriage or death. And Jewish motifs intrigued and occupied Chagall all through his career. And he was always, though, aware that he was a Jew in a Christian society. So he always had that duality. So in 1931, when Chagall was commissioned to paint a series of illustrations from the Bible, he visited the Holy Land for the first time. Here is Abraham and the three angels, rich with color and texture. And he threw himself obsessively into this project for the next 3 years. He loved Israel. He loved it right away, and he continued to love it through his life. He loved the history of the Jewish people, and he went back to Israel many, many times. He felt at home there. So why is that? Well, people spoke Yiddish, people spoke Russian. He was impressed with the pioneering spirit of the people. All the kibbutzim that he visited spoke to him personally about strength and renewal. And he immersed himself in the history of the Jews. He said that the Bible was the greatest source of poetry of all time. So overall, the 30s were a prolific time for Chagall. Here we see the lovers at the Eiffel Tower with the dark vertical of the tower on the left side. And it's an allegory of earthly happiness. It's an ode to marital love and to universal harmony, which is what he was feeling at the time. It was also, he painted a number of pictures that were an homage to Shakespeare. For example, A Midsummer Night's Dream. At the height of surrealism, when these types of paintings were becoming more common and more acceptable, with impossible and incongruous situations and human-animal figures. Then in 38, well, we know 1938 was a time of enormous change and enormous pressure and profound change throughout Europe. So Europe was on the brink of war, as we know, and Jews were suffering tragically. Then at this time came his powerful, very unusual painting, The White Crucifixion. And You will see here that Christ's loins are covered not with a loincloth, as we see in every other picture of the crucifixion, but with a tallis. And this is because Chagall wanted to show that Christ was a Jew. A beam of light floods down over the large white crucifix in the middle of the canvas. We've lost a little bit of the top of it here to fit onto the screen, but you can see the whole thing, I'm sure, in your mind. And Christ here is surrounded by scenes of the persecution and murder of the Jews. So Chagall said that Christ was the first Jew to suffer such anti-Semitism, a radical thought, and even a radical thought now. Radical thought at the time when he did it that created a tremendous stir in the art world. So in the painting, the world had gone mad, which it was beginning to throughout Europe. Burning houses and synagogues, soldiers marching, a mother carrying her baby away in her arms, rabbis in despair, an elderly man racing away from a burning Torah scroll. It was an atmosphere of immense tragedy. Fire that destroys and forces people to flee is also a recurring theme in Chagall's painting and is very apparent here. So reports were reaching France about the persecution of the Jews under the Nazi regime in Germany. And some of Chagall's paintings had already been burned in Germany as examples of degenerate art. So the Nazis had begun their campaign against modernist art as soon as they seized power. Any kind of art that was expressionist, cubist, abstract, or surreal in any way was targeted. Anything intellectual, anything Jewish or foreign or socialist inspired, or even difficult to understand, from Picasso to Matisse and all the way going back to Cézanne and Van Gogh, all of these were targeted by the Nazis. What was extolled, not so surprisingly, was traditional German realism, accessible and open to patriotic interpretation. So ironically, it was the Nazis who established Chagall as a Jewish artist. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, decreed that all paintings by Chagall in public collections in Germany must be burned, along with the works of other degenerates. So only his pinch of snuff, done in 1912, was saved. The Nazis confiscated overall 650 works of art from German museums for an exhibit that they planned to put on in Munich of so-called degenerate art. These paintings were to be mocked and disgraced by the millions who would visit the exhibit. And Chagall's life was changed by political circumstances once again. So the Germans made a mockery of Chagall's art, describing them as green, purple, and red Jews shooting out of the earth, fiddling on violins, flying through the air, and representing an assault on Western civilization. Along with thousands of other books, Hitler burned those that were written about Chagall's life. Chagall, who was always aware, acutely aware of his strong Jewish identity, said at this time, "If a painter is Jewish and paints life, how can he help having Jewish elements in his work? But if he is a good painter, there will be more than that. The Jewish element will be there, but his art will tend to approach the universal." Yet Germany and the Nazis did not see it this way. After Germany invaded and occupied France, the Chagalls naively remained in Vichy. They lived in a little house just outside of Marseille, and they refused to acknowledge what they saw every day, that French Jews, with the help of the Vichy government and the local police, were being collected and sent to German concentration camps. We know now that very few would return. So in 1941, Chagall and his wife were stripped of their French citizenship, of which he was so proud to be part of his adopted country, and now it was taken away from him, and they were arrested along with the other Jews. His only chance was America. He escaped at the last minute with a forged visa arranged by Varian Fry. Here is Varian Fry. He's an American journalist who ran a rescue operation and helped several thousand Jewish artists and intellectuals escape the Nazis. Chagall's name had been added to Fry's list of prominent artists whose lives were at risk by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There is a very, very deep and wonderful historic novel called The Flight Portfolio by Julie Oranger that describes Chagall's escape and the works of Varian Fry. So you may be interested in reading that. Well, Chagall and Bella fled. They left for America in May 1941, and when it was almost too late. And this is a significant date because they arrived in New York on June 23rd, 1941, one day after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So sadly, they had been forced to leave almost all his work behind. Furious at being forced to flee his adopted country because he was a Jew, he swore at the Germans. "If I were not a Jew, I would never have become an artist. It is only because of my heritage that I see what I see in the way I see it and do what I do in my way. I paint because I am a Jew." Fortunately, his daughter Ida made it to the US soon after, bringing several large crates full of rolled up canvases with her. So Chagall arrived in New York and stayed for the duration of the war, but he never liked it. In fact, he hated it. He refused to learn English. He lived on East 74th Street, and his life improved only when he found the Lower East Side. There he found the Jewish food that he liked, he read the Yiddish press, and he met people who could speak Yiddish and Russian. His work, however, in the US was not very well accepted at this time because he was considered too Russian. However, he was nevertheless soon commissioned to provide the backdrops and the stage settings for the large and prominent New York Ballet Theater's production of Tchaikovsky's works. It was a huge success. And you can see in these beautiful stage settings and backdrops the work that he was able to do. And then suddenly in 1944, when Chagall was 58 years old and the war was not yet over, Bella suddenly developed a serious viral infection. She was taken to the hospital, but the infection could not be treated because of a wartime shortage of medicine. Tragedy struck and Bella died. Chagall was grief-stricken. He said it was the worst time in his life. He didn't know if he would ever recover. He didn't know if he would ever paint again. Here is one of his very few works from this terrible time. You can see that deep emotion animates the whirl of figures around the crystal ball. And we see Bella on the right weeping, and he portrays himself on the lower left with his head upside down, symbolizing the total capsizing of his world. On top of that, he was devastated by the war news from Europe. He learned first, for the first time with many people in his generation in the United States, about the Holocaust and the concentration camps. And it nearly broke his already shaken spirit. He counted Bella among the Holocaust victims, feeling that their exile from Europe had sapped her will to live and taken her strength from her. He placed her in his mind with the millions of Jewish victims of the Nazis. Months later, to make things even worse, when he didn't think they could get any worse, he learned of the total destruction of his beloved Vitebsk. Out of 240,000 people, only 118 survived. In 1948, he left New York, a broken man. He traveled widely through Europe, trying to find himself, trying to get lost at the same time. He was 61 years old, and without his Bella, he was alone. He went back to Paris, but he couldn't connect. Finally, he found a small artist village called Vence in the southern part of France in the state of Provence, and he set up residence there. It was a charming and beautiful place, and it worked for him. He found the village filled with a sense of possibility that calmed him and fortified him, and slowly his spirit came to life again. Now, his work at this time now focused on universal themes, often incorporating motifs from Greek mythology and Christianity. He integrated Jewish culture as part of his vision, and he gave his Jewish heritage priority in his paintings. In addition to painting, he created richly colored stained glass windows at this time that were then displayed in numerous churches and cathedrals in France and Germany. And he bequeathed his masterful Bible illustrations to the French city of Nice. Now, later on, his daughter Ida would set up a museum to honor him in Nice filled with his Bible illustrations, and she would go on to run a foundation to protect his works and to run the museum for the rest of her life. And finally, Chagall did find love again. He married a woman who had been born in Kiev, Ukraine, named Valentina Brodsky. He called her Vava. And although he wrote that he was happy with her, she was not the soulmate he had found in Bella. Perhaps that happens only once in life. But still, energy for his work returned. And he was successful at the many new art forms that he tried at this time: sculpture, decorated ceramics, mosaics, and graphic art. He created tapestries, designs for tapestries. He didn't weave them himself, but he created the designs. 3 giant ones, for example, depicting scenes from Jewish history. These were created for the State Hall of Israel's Parliament building, the Knesset. And here is a part of the enormous illustrations, the installation that he created. We know, of course, about his 12 splendid stained glass windows at the synagogue at the Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem that depict the 12 tribes of Israel. And in New York City at the UN, his greatly admired windows, everyone's favorite, entitled Peace at the United Nations. And his other glorious windows were installed in public buildings in Germany, in France and Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Interestingly, he painted the ceiling at the Paris Opera when he was 77. Now, he didn't do this on his back on scaffolding. He painted on the ground and on easels. But nevertheless, the choice of a Russian Jew to work on a French national monument caused some controversy, as you can imagine. So he portrayed the Olympus of classical music in his mural, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Ravel, Wagner, Mozart. And once, however, the large, inspiring, deep and beautiful paintings were installed, they were hugely praised. And the ceiling paintings took him a year to complete. And the final canvas was 2,400 square feet, probably the square footage of an average house when you think of 2,400 square feet, and required 440 pounds of paint. So in later years, Chagall concentrated on painting murals and designing wall hangings and mosaics, plus decorations at the Vatican and stained glass windows for many of the famous cathedrals throughout Europe, the Reims Cathedral in France, and in New York, in the United States, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Chichester Cathedral in England. And he was one of the very few artists to exhibit work at the Louvre in their lifetime. A sudden heart attack at his home in Vence brought Chagall to his end. He was 97, and he had lived so long that one of his critics joked that he had lived almost long enough to visit his own centennial exhibition. So was Marc Chagall a painter first or a Jew first? He had his own code for dealing with this distinction. Here are his thoughts on the subject. Jewish artist circles can debate the definition of Jewish art all they want. That's fine. I would always say to them, keep talking, keep talking. I'll just go ahead and paint. So now, thank you for being such an attentive audience, and I'll be happy to answer questions that you might have.
Thanks, Linda.
Okay. I will take off my screen, stop sharing, and let's see where we are. Okay, there we are. Good.
Thanks
Okay.
very much. That was super.
Oh,
I
thank
do
you
see some questions coming up on the Q&A posting, and I'll just encourage people who are out there to please type in any questions you have.
Okay.
One question that came up while you were speaking was from Gina. She asked about how did Marc Chagall's daughter Ida get out of the USSR or France, and why wasn't she traveling with her parents when they were able to come to the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, she was in France at the time also. She was 25 and she was married, so she had a separate household. And Varian Fry tried to get visas for her also, but was not able to. And she was able to come through another type of program that was not a rescue program, but she was able to get the visas to the US that way. And she was not restricted the way he was, where he had to get out immediately, and she was able that way to bring over some of his paintings. Thank goodness.
I had a question of my own, and I see there are more coming up, but I'm wondering about when did Marc Chagall become financially successful?
Oh,
Was it while he was in Russia? Was it while he was in France? Was it only later in life? When was
that's a
that?
very good question. He was in Paris in the 30s and was able to develop some success at that time. So that's a very good question about financial success. Those are the sorts of things that don't always show up in the biographies. But we know that if he's selling widely, that he's doing okay. And we also know that Bella's parents allowed her to marry him. So that was earlier in 1915, but it took him really until the early 30s before he was widely known and able to depend on himself for his financial success.
One person asks about, do you know where Mark, Ida, and his wives are buried?
He and his wife are buried in Vance, in the city that he lived in, and it's a non-sectarian cemetery. It's not a Jewish cemetery. And I don't know where Ida was buried. He died in 1985, and she lived until 1994. And so I don't know whether she was in the US at the time. My guess would be that she was buried somewhere in Nice because she was running his museum and his foundation from there. But his grave can be visited, and also Vava's in Vance, if for those lucky enough to go to Provence.
One person also asks about, to what degree was Marc Chagall's art accepted by the non-Jewish art world, and if there was a moment where that happened, where he went from becoming something accepted more in the Jewish community to one that was more broadly accepted.
Mm-hmm. He was, of course, ultimately accepted everywhere. But as he said, he was always aware that he was a Jew in Christian society. He seemed to be accepted most broadly when his works came to the US, and people stopped remembering that he was a Jew, because his paintings were then more universal, and this was later in his life when he was in his 60s. And when he was doing more of the stage settings, when his murals were put up in Lincoln Center, in the Metropolitan Opera in the early 60s when that was built. So it took until then. I'm not sure it ever went away. It is just the way the world is.
A couple of people asked about a particular piece of art, the bridal chair. Are you familiar with that painting? And could you tell anything about it to the audience?
Yeah, there was a book written about the bridal chair from Ida's point of view. And it was written by a novelist who was very much able to write in the first person as if she were the person who was admiring this piece of work. I don't have it in my talk because it wasn't as popular as many of his others, but it definitely was extolled in this novel. And the book is worth reading. It's Ida Chagall's voice, fictionalized, of course, but very interesting to see her comments about her family life and her parents. It was basically a happy story. She seemed to have had a good life.
A couple of people are posing questions about some of the animals that are depicted in Chagall's work. One about birds that are in the wedding, in some of the wedding scenes, or chickens. Are there particular significance that you're aware of to those particular animals, or what do we take from them?
Well, Chagall liked chickens because they were from his hometown. So chickens, goats, and cows show up all the time. Farm animals were a part of his life growing up. They wandered the town. There weren't cars or trucks or any kind of scary loud vehicles. There were just horses and carts and donkeys and carts. And there were always farm animals wandering. So he had a particular feeling about chickens. He just thought they were a very natural animal and that they brought joy to people. In terms of birds, he had a real thing about freedom. And this was his sense of his being constrained by his Judaism. And also, he didn't feel that people should be stuck on the ground. So his paintings have a lot of flying figures because he believed that gravity should not really hold us back. And of course, birds know this instinctively, and they are up in the air. So that's basically the significance that he puts on those creatures.
Excellent. A couple of people are also asking questions about the family, about both his parents and whether they came to appreciate his artistic skills and his career choice, and also more about his daughter and if there are grandchildren and surviving family members.
Well, I don't know about grandchildren. That's a good thing. I should look that up. I don't know. There's not that much written about Ida, although we do know she married and that she was in Nice. And in terms of his parents, they didn't live that long. So he was, the oldest child, and they did come to recognize his talent, particularly his mother. His father died, I think, 10 years before his mother. So he did have some recognition from his family because he became famous for making Vitebsk famous. So at one point he founded an art institute in Vitebsk that he wanted to bring to the people everything he had learned from his travels and his experiences living in Paris and in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. It didn't go off all that well because of the political situation. As I had said earlier, the communists really didn't like his art, didn't understand it. His parents did come to appreciate it somewhat, but there's not much written about them, but it seems as if it was hard for them to overcome the Hasidic, ultra-religious views of not having any pictures or paintings in your life. And so it was a real problem for them all along.
There's also a couple of questions about just where you can see his work now. Is the museum in Nice still open, and are there other places where there's a collection of his works to see?
Yes, the museum in Nice is still open, and in New York you can see his work at the Guggenheim and at the Metropolitan, at the Museum of Modern Art, not at the Metropolitan, and also at Lincoln Center. And there's a place in Kuyt, which is Roosevelt's home in Westchester, and there are a couple of stained glass windows there. And then, of course, Peace at the UN.
Some people are asking about some of the other work that he did. Did he paint or do any artwork about the Holocaust specifically? And then somebody else, a somewhat related question about his ceramic art, and if that was a genre he delved into, and if that was a large part of his work.
Mm-hmm. He did delve into ceramic art. It never became a large part of his work. It was the time when he was concentrating on Greek motifs. And so he painted and developed patterns for Greek motifs on the ceramic art, on the jars and the plates. It never became a big thing with him. He was so prolific in each of the areas where he worked. He did much more in mosaics. And that was a much bigger part of his work in his later life. In terms of the Holocaust, he did not do, as far as I know, anything specific about the Holocaust. He did his White Crucifixion, where he had the people who were suffering at the time in the Holocaust on its way. But there's nothing that I know of where he did any burning synagogues specifically or any kind of concentration camp pictures.
Some people are also asking questions about the confiscated art that the Nazis took and whether that was ever rescued or if the only early works are the ones that Ida brought over.
Oh, fortunately, most of them were rescued. That Museum of Degenerate Art never happened, thank goodness. So most of them were rescued, of the 650 that were taken from the museums throughout Europe.
Was Chagall, somebody asked, was Chagall a religious and observant Jew? Or some of the, obviously you quote a lot about how he described himself as Jewish. Was he practicing?
No, he was a cultural Jew. He was not practicing. Once he left his hometown and left the Hasidic life that he had at home with his parents, he was not observant. He was always Jewish inside. He was Jewish in his expressions. He was what we think of today as culturally Jewish. And of course, being buried not in a Jewish cemetery, his second wife was not Jewish. And so he just had a different range of experiences. He was the type of person who would think of himself as a citizen of the world and not be tied to a particular religion or a set of observances.
Somebody poses a question about who Marc Chagall hung out with in terms of artists in France. Was he a person who was, in the same network as Picasso and Miro? And was he concerned about what was going on in Spain in the 1930s as well, and got involved in that at all?
I don't know of his involvement in Spain. He was not very political. Politics mostly affected him by making him go to one place or the other, giving him citizenship, taking away citizenship. It's like when the Nazis came, he just said, I'm not part of this. I don't matter. Why would they bother me? I'm a Jew, but so what? Who cares? And clearly the Nazis did not feel that way. So I don't know of any involvement with Spain. In terms of his artistic circle, he was able to get into the high-level artistic circle, and in Paris, and Picasso and Miro and those artists were his friends and supporters.
There's a couple of people who would like to have the names of the books you mentioned just clarified. I couldn't remember the titles myself, but could you just tell the audience if there are key books that you've read or would suggest people to use when learning more about Chagall?
Well, the main thing I would read would be Chagall's autobiography, because the language is so beautiful. You know, just like when he says the Bible is the greatest source of poetry of all time, this is a person who thinks about poetry and thinks about beauty in the written word in addition to the visual beauty that he created. So I would send them there. I would say that's the first place to start.
Somebody also mentions that there apparently is a YouTube video of his twin granddaughters, Ida's children, discussing him. So I guess that he did have grandchildren.
I guess so. I don't know about that. I'll have to look into it and see whether any of them became artists. That's very interesting. What a legacy.
I'm afraid our time has come to an end, but I would like to thank you again, Linda, for such a lovely presentation and for being part of this program. And I'd like to thank the audience for being here and watching this as well. We're going to make this recording available on YouTube, so I'll send out information about that after the program. But thank you, everybody, and enjoy your day.
Good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.